In today's video, I'll be ranking every card, every evolution, and every tower troop in Clash Royale for the month of October. Ever since the Goblinstein as well as the Evolved Electro Drag got added to the game, and we recently had balance changes, the meta has changed quite a lot since September. So I'm going to be ranking all the cards now. As always, S tier is the highest tier. It means the card is very versatile and likely needs a nerf. A tier means the card is above average. B is the upper end of average. C is kind of slightly below average. D is well below average. And F tier means the card is not versatile at all and there's a high chance it could use a buff. Starting off with the Bomber, and just a note, this is the regular Bomber, not the Evolved Bomber. I'll be doing all the evolutions at the end. It's going to be going in A tier, a fairly versatile card. It's 2 Elixir and deals splash damage. You can use it in heavier decks, like with the Lava Hound, for example, and the P.E.K.K.A. And of course, it's going to be very good inside of cycle decks with the Goblin Drill, and it gets a lot of value throughout the match. The Goblins will also be going in A tier. They deal a lot of DPS for only 2 Elixir. They're very good inside of some cycle decks, like with the Hog Rider, for example, or the Goblin Drill, but they don't quite make S tier because a lot of people prefer using the guards over them in this current meta because of how many people are using the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. as well as the arrows, but the Goblins are still very good. The Spear Goblins are going to be going in B tier. Ever since they got that small buff a few months ago, it has definitely helped them out, and they have seen a return inside of minor wall breakers, also with Mortar Bait and Mega Knight Bait decks, and they can be pretty good for getting chip damage. The Zap is going in D tier. Recently, it has been pretty weak compared to other spells, and the main reason people play it is to get to that Evolve Zap, which is significantly stronger, which is why pretty much everyone playing it has the Evolve version. You can use it if you really want to, though, inside of a Lava deck or a Giant deck, for example. The regular Knight is going to be going in A tier. He has really good stats for his cost, as a lot of people say. It's true, he's got a lot of health for only 3 Elixir. He's a very good tank, and he pairs exceptionally well in a lot of different cycle decks. I mean, you could run him in Hog, you could use him in Log Bait, you could run him inside of Mortar, you could run him inside of Graveyard. There's a lot of variety and a lot of value opportunity you can get with him. The regular archers are going in D tier. The only deck you see them in for the most part is Expo, and even in that, they're not a requirement. Arrows are just so prevalent in the meta, which are a great counter to them, and the main reason people play them is to eventually get to the Evolved Archers. The minions are going to go in C tier. I would say they're a pretty average card. Arrows do take them out really easily, but oftentimes they're able to get a little bit of value before they die. They pair pretty nicely inside of Lava decks and also Giant Graveyard. The first card going in S tier is going to be the Arrows. They recently got a nerf where they deal less damage to towers, but it did not make much of an impact. Clearly, they are incredibly versatile, especially among beatdown decks. You see them always with the P.E.K.K.A., the Lava Hound, the Giant, the Goblin Giant, but you can also use them in cheaper decks too with the Mortar, for example, maybe inside of a Recruit Spam Bait deck, and more. They have such a large radius, they're so consistent, and especially as the match goes on in double and triple Elixir where there's so many things on the board, they're guaranteed value every single time. The Cannon is actually going in S tier. At the moment in this meta, it is the best building in the game. All the cycle decks are using it at the moment. I'm talking about Pig's EQ Cycle, which uses the Cannon, Hog Cycle, which is using the Cannon currently over the Bomb Tower, Goblin Drill Cycle, and Bait are all using it because it is actually a pretty effective counter to the Goblinstein and happens to be very cheap. So it's getting a lot of value in this current meta because of how versatile it is among the cycle decks, and it's the building of choice currently. In the last set of balance changes, the Tesla got a small buff. It has not helped it very much, though. I would say currently it is B tier. It is being outshined by the Cannon by a ton because the Cannon is just getting the job done on defense in a lot of situations for 1 less Elixir. And there's not a lot of Lava Hound in this meta, so there's less of a need to use the Tesla. The regular Mortar is going in C tier. The main reason people use the Mortar is to eventually get to that Evolved Mortar, which is a lot better. The Evolved Mortar, though, got a nerf, which technically is an indirect nerf to the regular Mortar because there's less people that are going to want to be using it. So at the moment, it is currently an average building. The skeletons are going in A tier, kind of the same situation as the goblins, where some people like using the skeletons in their cycle deck, or maybe with the Royal Giant, for example, you can use them, but compared to the guards, definitely not used nearly as much as them in this current meta, and the evolved skeletons are way more broken compared to the regular ones. The barbarians, guys, are actually going in F tier. I think they have just gotten weaker and weaker as the meta has continued to change, and even inside of Lava Hound decks, there's not really anyone running them. And even the evolved barbarians are pretty weak too, which means the regular ones, there's not really going to be any incentive to use them, so I think a small buff could be justified for them. The minion horde is going to go in D tier. Probably no surprise that it's not really that good with how many people are running arrows in the meta, and even fireball, poison, splash units going to be very effective at taking it out, which is why you pretty much are only going to see it inside of some mortar bait decks from time to time, or some swarm decks, but not very frequently. The tombstone is going to go in C tier. There's not really anyone that uses this card inside of graveyard decks anymore, and even inside of lava, it's not a requirement anymore. Most lava players tend to not use a building, so it kind of fell off a bit, and definitely, I would say, a slightly below average card now. The musketeer's also going to be going in C tier. I feel like besides 2.6 and the occasional loon cycle, you're not really seeing her. You're just going to be much better off using stronger support cards oftentimes, which is why she's not going to be super high up. The Valkyrie, I'm going to be putting in B tier. I usually put her in C tier, but I noticed she's been making a small comeback recently inside of bait decks and also Hog X NATO. With that being said, though, the Knight, of course, is going to be a better option in majority of situations. The Hog Rider is going to be going in A tier. He's definitely one of the best win conditions in this meta. He also happens to pair quite nicely with the Goblinstein, and there's a lot of different variations you can play. Of course, there's standard 2.6, there's Hog EQ, which made a comeback, and also Hog X NATO, and he can be really difficult to stop if you don't have a building or a tornado in your deck. The Mini P.E.K.K.A is actually going to be going in B tier, a little higher than I placed it, because in this meta, it's actually very good with the Hog Rider, and the Mini P.E.K.K.A is actually a somewhat decent counter to the Goblinstein, and a alternative to the P.E.K.K.A. It's a lot cheaper and still gets the job done pretty well. Fireball is going to be going in A tier. Definitely a fantastic spell if you need direct damage, and it's pretty versatile as well. You can use it with the Royal Giant, you can use it with the Expo, you can use it with the Lava Hound, you could run it with P.E.K.K.A if you want. Forgot if I already said Hog, Goblin Drill, a lot of different things you can use it with, a lot of variety, and a very consistent spell. The Bomb Tower is actually going to be going in C tier. Even in this meta, Goblin Drill, everyone running Goblin Drill for the most part is using it with the cannon over the Bomb Tower, and it's the same thing with the Hog Rider. So the Bomb Tower, definitely not that good of a building in this current meta. The Giant is going to be going in C tier. He actually fell off quite a bit because he was one of the best win conditions in the game a few months ago, but I think the evolved P.E.K.K.A as well as the Goblinstein has definitely changed things, where there's not really as many people running Giant Graveyard anymore, or Giant Prince for that matter, so he's now kind of a below average win condition. The Wizard is going to be going in F tier. The only reason people use him is for the evolution, and his evolution was recently nerfed too, so there's less people running the Wizard now altogether. The Inferno Tower is going to be going in B tier. Definitely a bit better than the Bomb Tower in this meta, because there's some people using the Inferno Tower for all the tanks, like the evolved P.E.K.K.A, the evolved Mega Knight, and more, because it's actually a pretty effective counter to them, and it also pairs very well in bait decks, and bait is pretty decent at the moment. As per usual, the Goblin Hut will be going in F tier. It's just very hard to get value out of it. It's so vulnerable to spells, and it doesn't really fit in any deck. The Rocket is going to be going in B tier with the Inferno. Pretty much everyone running the Inferno is running the Rocket with it, and there's also some people using the Rocket in Hog X NATO, so it's a decent spell in this current meta. The Elixir Collector is going to be going in D tier. Surprisingly, the Void nerf didn't really help revive it for some reason. It has still not really seen an increase in usage since then. Three Musketeers is still never really being seen ever, and the Pump is still a pretty bad card. The Goblin Curse will also be going in D tier. It got a very small buff in the last set of balance changes, but that has hardly helped it at all. You can pretty much only use it in one bait deck, and even in that deck, it's kind of a question whether it's even a requirement. The Barbarian Hut is going to be joining the Goblin Hut in F tier. At this point, it's pretty much just becoming a routine for the poor Barbarian Hut. It's just same story as the Goblin Hut. It is just not getting you any value, and there's not really any deck you're going to want to use it in. The Archer Queen is going to be going in A tier. She's currently the second best champion in this meta. There's a lot of people using her in Pig's EQ. They're actually using the Queen over the Goblinstein. People have found that she fits a lot better in that deck, and the Queen tends to be an okay counter to the Goblinstein as well, which is why I think she's the second best champion currently. The Mirror is going to be going in F tier. I mean, you have to spend one more elixir to play the same card, and in some situations, it's not even good to play the same thing again, and it kind of makes your cycle awkward. The Rage is going to be going in A tier, actually a very good small spell in this current meta. There's so many people using it with the Evolved P.E.K.K.A, the Evolved Goblin Giant, the Goblinstein inside of bait decks. It goes very well with the Ram Rider. Just a very annoying card that synergizes very well with a lot of the broken cards in this meta. The Skeleton Army is going to be going in F tier. Honestly, there's pretty much just no reason to use this card. There's not any deck it fits in. Back in the day, you could have used it inside of Giant Graveyard or maybe in Loon Freeze, but even in those things, you don't even really see it anymore. The regular Goblin Barrel is going to go in C tier. I feel like it's a pretty average card. I think it's very easy to counter with spells. The Evolved Goblin Barrel is significantly better than it though, and most people running the Goblin Barrel now have the Evolved version. The Baby Dragon will also be going in C tier. It used to be a lot better, but I feel like as better cards have been added, like the Phoenix, it has kind of fallen out of the meta, but you can use it inside of a graveyard deck or maybe a P.E.K.K.A deck if you really want to. The Freeze is actually going to be going in C tier. It's a bit better in this current meta because there's a lot of people using it with the Evolved P.E.K.K.A and Balloon Freeze. Very OP combination, and of course Graveyard Freeze you can use it in as well. The Witch is going to be going in F tier. I feel like kind of like the Wizard, she's just pretty weak, very vulnerable to spells, and it's kind of hard to fit her in any deck. Unlike the Wizard though, she doesn't even have an evolution, so there's pretty much no point in using her. The Prince is going to be going in C tier. He has fallen off quite a bit. After they overbuffed the charge, how often he was able to charge, and then they nerfed it back down, he has just been a lot worse since then, and for the most part, you only see him inside of a bait deck occasionally, but that's about it. The Balloon is going to be going in A tier. I wouldn't say it quite deserves S tier, but like the Hog Rider, definitely one of the stronger win conditions in this meta. You can use it with the Lava Hound, you could use Loon Cycle. There's some going around with the Evolved Cage. There's a lot more people using it with that ever since the Evolved Cage got a buff. And then, of course, you could use the Loon inside of P.E.K.K.A Loon Freeze, which some people are using now that the Evolved P.E.K.K.A is very good. So definitely a solid win condition and can be hard to stop if you don't have good air cards or buildings. The Giant Skeleton is going to be going in D tier. I think it's just very difficult to run in this current meta with all the people running the P.E.K.K.A, and it's just hard to fit in decks. It's kind of an awkward card. It's not necessarily a bad card, it's just hard to have synergy with it. The Lightning Guys is actually going in S tier, believe it or not, because it is by far the strongest big spell or expensive spell in the game. Definitely better than the Fireball, the Poison, and the Rocket by a mile in this current meta, and a big part of the reason is because of how many people are running the Goblinstein, and the Lightning is pretty much one of the only spells that does very well against it because, of course, it's able to kill the Doctor, and then because it has a large radius, you're often able to hit the monster of the Goblinstein, the Doctor, and then maybe something else. Maybe you can clip like a cannon with it, a Tesla, or another unit. It also has good synergy with a lot of the decks that are very good in this meta, like the Evolved P.E.K.K.A, of course. It goes very well with the Ram Rider, and you just see it a lot inside of Goblinstein decks. The Expo is actually going to be going in D tier, definitely one of the worst win conditions in this meta. Probably no surprise because of how prevalent the Goblinstein is, which I feel like is a pretty good counter to the Expo, as well as all the other tanks like the Evolved P.E.K.K.A, the Evolved Goblin Giant. It's pretty difficult to get an Expo lock in this current meta. The Goblin Machine is going to be going in F tier. I feel like the 5% health buff it got hardly did anything, and it is still for sure one of the worst cards in the game. The P.E.K.K.A is going to be going in A tier. This is the regular P.E.K.K.A I'm talking about. The regular P.E.K.K.A is well above average, but I don't quite think the regular P.E.K.K.A deserves S tier because the majority of people running the P.E.K.K.A right now at the top of ladder and in competitive are all using the evolved version. The evolved version is what's very, very broken, but because the P.E.K.K.A itself is above average, any type of evolution it has is just going to be incredibly broken, and the evolution it currently has is so broken, which is why there's so much P.E.K.K.A. But I think the regular one is not quite S tier because compared to the evolution, definitely not as broken. But the regular P.E.K.K.A you can still use if you want with the Ram Rider or maybe with the Balloon, but the evolved one is just so much stronger, which is why I have it in A tier. The Golem's going to be going in D tier, probably no surprise because the Pump is really bad in the current meta. The Goblinstein doesn't pair well at all with the Golem, and with all the evolved P.E.K.K.A you can't expect Golem to be very good. That's also why the regular Royal Giant is going to be going in C tier. I feel like it's hard for him in a lot of matchups in this current meta because of all the evolved P.E.K.K.A and also the Goblinstein, which doesn't really pair well with him. The Three Musketeers are going to be going in F tier. For a long time now, they have been very bad, and there's been pretty much no one using them. They're even worse now because of how bad the Elixir Collector is. Personally, I wouldn't mind if they get an evolution. I think that would be a nice way of buffing them without the regular version of them being absurdly broken. The Dark Prince is going to be going in D tier. There's pretty much no one using him anymore, and strangely enough, he didn't get the charge buff that the Prince got, and I feel like it would have been fitting if he got that same buff, and I feel like as a result, more people use the Prince after that buff, but the Dark Prince kind of was used less because people would prefer to use the Prince over him. The Poison is going to be going in A tier, a nice medium spell kind of like the Fireball. You can use it, of course, with the P.E.K.K.A. You can use it with the Graveyard. The Goblin Drill it's going to be very good in, getting a lot of value in a lot of situations, and it deals a nice amount of chip damage to towers as well. The Princess is going to be going in B tier. There's a decent amount of people running her in bait decks this season, and she can be very annoying, of course, if you don't have arrows or log in your deck. Believe it or not, guys, the Ice Wizard is going in A tier. There's so many more people using him now ever since he got that splash radius buff. The way you know he's a lot better now is there's a lot of people running him and they're not even pairing the Tornado with him because it's not needed anymore because the radius is already larger. That's why you're seeing him now inside of Mortar decks. So not only just Graveyard decks anymore, but also Mortar. And also P.E.K.K.A Loon Freeze he's good in. And I've even seen some people play him in some other things as well. Just seems to be a lot more versatile and way stronger than before. The Fire Spirit's going to be going in C tier. I feel like one of the worst spirits in the game. Not really many decks it fits in. I mean, you could use it with the Goblin Drill if you want. It deals a good amount of DPS, but you're better off using the other spirits over it. The Furnace is going to be going in F tier, just like the other spawners. It's just simply not that good. Spells are too good against it. There's not really any deck it fits in, and you just shouldn't use it. I don't know. The Guards are going to be going in S tier. I think they are extremely strong in this current meta, primarily because of the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. The Evolved P.E.K.K.A has to swing twice in order to kill them, which of course is very valuable because the goblins and the skeletons on the other hand get one-shotted, which means the P.E.K.K.A is just constantly going to be healing, and that's not the case for the guards, where the guards are just going to be significantly better at being able to take that Evolved P.E.K.K.A out when paired with other things. They also happen to be very versatile. You can use the guards with the Evolved P.E.K.K.A, with the Evolved Goblin Giant. They're going to be very good with Mortar. You could also use them with Drill, Lava Hound, Royal Giant, you name it. A very, very strong card in this current meta. They also don't die to arrows. The Miner's going to be going in A tier, definitely not as broken as he used to be after all the nerfs he has gotten, but still a very consistent card and secondary win condition. He goes very well with the Mortar. He's also used a lot with the Lava Hound, and there's some Balloon Cycle decks in this current meta that he pairs very well in. The Sparky's going to be going in D tier. Just seems to be very bad in this current meta. There's a lot of stuns. Lightning is very good in this meta. Giant isn't in the best spot, and it's just really hard to get a Sparky connection to the tower with all the stuns in the game. Could be another card where if it continues falling out of the meta more and more, might be one where an evolution for it could be kind of interesting. In this current meta, I'm actually going to put the Lava Hound in B tier. I think there's less people using it, and a big part of it might be because of how good the Goblinstein is, and when there's a Lava Hound as well as a Balloon lined up, and you pop the ability, you're actually able to hit both of those things at once for only 2 Elixir, getting you a lot of value. That's why there's a lot of people running Balloon decks where the Balloon is in the deck but not the Lava Hound, which is why, because there's a lot more people running the Balloon, I consider the Balloon to be a tier higher than the Lava Hound. The best spirit in the game is going to be the Ice Spirit, which is why I'm putting it in S tier. In cycle decks, it is so strong and gets you so much value defensively, which is why you always see it with the Goblin Drill, the Expo, the Hog Rider, the Royal Hogs, Log Bait, and probably a few other things I'm forgetting. It just stalls things out for so long, very consistent, and just gets a lot of value continuously throughout the match. The Golden Knight is going to be going in D tier. Definitely one of the worst champions in the game. There's not really any deck I can think of where you're definitely going to want to have him in it. You could even make the argument that he needs a buff, but I don't think he's completely awful. You could use him if you want. It's just hard to fit him in decks. The Bowler's going to be going in B tier. In this current meta, he's actually not that OP. I think a big part of the reason is probably because of all the Goblinstein, and you can't really pair the Goblinstein and the Bowler in the same deck, so it's probably just a meta situation where he's going to be better again when the Goblinstein is a bit weaker, but you can of course use him inside of graveyard decks if you want, or some other things, and he can get quite a lot of value defensively knocking things back. And as per usual, the Log is going to be going in S tier. Every meta, you see it constantly inside of cycle decks. Kind of the same as the arrows. Pretty much you either have the arrows or the Log in your deck. That oftentimes is the case, especially if you don't have a larger spell in your deck. That tends to be the requirement. You're always seeing it with the Hog Rider, the Expo, Log Bait, Royal Giant, Drill, probably a ton of other things. I could go on all day about every deck you could fit the Log in. Only 2 Elixir, knocks things back, very consistent, and survives every meta. Is there really anything more to say? The Lumberjack is going to be going in C tier. There's actually a bit more people using him again because of Lumber Loon Freeze, which is making a bit of a comeback. No one's really running it anymore in Golem, though. The Ice Golem is going to be going in D tier. There isn't really anyone using it anymore except 2.6 players. The Mega Minion's also going to be going in D tier because it's just a lot weaker compared to the Inferno Drag as well as the Phoenix, which people are using a lot more currently. The Inferno Drag is going to be going in B tier. Normally I have it in A, but because of the Goblinstein and the Doctor, of course, which is able to stun things and how many people are running it, it's going to be slightly worse. Still going to be great against tanks, and of course the Lava Hound is a fantastic tool to have inside of your Lava Hound deck. The Graveyard is actually going to be going in C tier. I don't really know what has happened recently, but the Graveyard went from being one of the best win conditions in the game to honestly a slightly below average win condition. There's just a lot less people playing it now, and it's probably because of the meta. The Goblinstein doesn't really pair very well with the Graveyard, and just all the broken cards in the meta as well kind of made it fall out of the meta a little bit. The Elite Barbarians are going to be going in D tier. If you know what you're doing, they're going to be fairly easy to counter, but of course when they're over leveled on mid ladder, they can be a nuisance. The Skeleton King is going to be going in B tier. Definitely not a bad champion, especially because of how well it pairs in that Mortar bait deck, which you see a lot in this meta. That one with the Cannon Cart and those baity cards gets him a lot of value because there's a lot of opportunities for him to fill up his bar and get the ability off. The Tornado is going to be going in A tier, definitely one of the stronger spells in the game. Very nice to get King Tower activations or pull things away from your win condition. The Evolved E-Drag pairs exceptionally well with the Tornado, where you are often going to see it, of course, inside of P.E.K.K.A, Loon, Freeze. You could use it inside of Graveyard decks, even though the Graveyard doesn't happen to be very good at the moment. Every Graveyard deck, for the most part, is using the Tornado, Hog X NATO, and it also is decent, I feel like, with the Goblin Stein as well, because you NATO things into the monster, and then you're able to get a nice ability off in some cases. The Clone is going to be going in F tier. There's not even really anyone that runs Lava Clone anymore. There's just way too many spells that are good against it, like the Poison, the Tornado, and the Arrow, so it's really hard for it to get any sort of value. The Goblin Demolisher is actually going to be going in C tier. He's a lot worse now after the nerf he got, and there's a lot less people using him. For the most part, you only see it with the Goblin Drill occasionally now. The Electro Wizard will also be going in C tier. I feel like there's a lot better support cards than him, and you might occasionally see him in P.E.K.K.A from time to time, but that's about it. The Goblin Gang is going to be going in A tier. The Spear Goblin buff, of course, is a big buff for the Goblin Gang because there's Spear Goblins in it, and there's tons of people using it inside of bait decks, mortar decks, and also recruit spam, making it a very versatile card in this current meta, and it gets a lot of value. And the Dark Goblin is going to be going in A tier pretty much for the same reason as the Goblin Gang. All the decks that you see the Goblin Gang in, the Dark Goblin is often paired with it. I'm talking about mortar, recruit spam, typical log bait decks, and more. Ever since the Dark Goblin got that damage buff, it has really helped the card out. The Battle Ram is going to be going in D tier. I feel like it's very hard to get it to reach the tower because of all the buildings and stuns in the game, and the non-evolution is just overall pretty weak, and even the evolve version isn't that good either, so there's just not a lot of incentive to run the Battle Ram. The Executioner will also be going in D tier. I feel like he has just overall been struggling in this current meta. A big part of it is probably because of the Goblin Stein, and having both the Goblin Stein and the Executioner in the same deck isn't really good synergy. And honestly, guys, I had a feeling that this was gonna happen because the nerf they gave it was just ridiculously too much, in my opinion. The Void is going in F tier. Ever since it got that massive damage nerf, I believe it was 32%, which just sounds absurd saying it out loud, but I'm pretty sure it was 32%. I was thinking it should have been 20% because that would have been, I think, a little bit more reasonable and wasn't going to completely kill the card, and this is kind of what I expected to happen. Pretty much no one is running the Void anymore, which is also why the Lightning is as broken as it is, because in a way the Lightning is somewhat similar to the Void because of the multiple strike aspect of the cards. So both those cards kind of did a flip-flop in a way, because the Lightning before was kind of below average as a card, but now it's one of the best cards in the game. The Bats are going to be going in D tier. They kind of fell off a lot, and there's not really many people running them anymore. The only time you're really ever going to see them is their evolved version, which of course is just significantly better because you're getting that healing aspect of them, which can make them a lot more threatening. The Heal Spirit's also going to be going in D tier. There's not really any deck it's being played in currently. I mean, you could run it inside of Sparky if you really want to, but Sparky itself isn't in a good spot. The Bandit is going to be going in B tier. She's a pretty good support card inside of P.E.K.K.A as well as Mega Knight decks, but surprisingly, even with how good the P.E.K.K.A is in this meta, she's not being used quite as much as you think she would be. There's people preferring to run other support cards instead, like the Ghost and the Fisherman instead of her. The Night Witch is going to be going in D tier. Maybe not a big surprise because of how bad Giant Graveyard is, as well as Golem in this current meta. The Night Witch kind of falls off with those two decks as well. The Skeleton Barrel is going to be going in C tier. Definitely a little better after the death damage buff it got, but of course it's not going to make it OP. It just went from being a pretty bad card to being only slightly below average now, I would say. It's pretty good inside of Mega Knight Bait and also Recruit spam decks. The Mighty Miner is going to be going in C tier. In this current meta, he's definitely not that great because of how good the Goblinstein is. And of course, because of the Doctor, which stuns things, it's going to stun the Mighty Miner consistently, making him not be very effective in this meta. The Flying Machine will be going in B tier. In this current meta, it's actually quite good with the recruits as well as with the Ramrider, and even in some lava decks. It's been being played a bit more recently. The cannon card's going to be going in A tier. Ever since it got that buff, the card has been well above average, especially inside of that mortar bait deck. It is seen constantly and defensively gets a lot of value, and there's a lot of situations where you're able to get it to lock on the tower as well. It can also be pretty good in some bridge spam decks or inside of log bait. The regular Mega Knight is going to be going in D tier. Maybe not a surprise, because in this current meta, there's so many people running the P.E.K.K.A, which of course is just a great counter to the regular Mega Knight. And the evolved Mega Knight is just way better than the standard one, and that's of course the main reason people use the standard one, is to eventually get to the evolved version. The Zappies are going to be going in D tier. They're just not really played anymore, very hard to fit in decks. I feel like they're pretty easy to counter, and they don't really get a lot of value in most situations. The Suspicious Bush will also be going in D tier, actually. They increased the speed of the bush itself, but it has not actually really helped the card out all that much. It's kind of a similar situation to the Goblin Curse, where it seems like it just wasn't enough of a buff for it to be effective in the meta. The Barbarian Barrel is going to be going in B tier. There's a lot of small spells that are better than it, like the arrows and the log, but it's still going to be pretty good in some heavier decks. You can use it with the P.E.K.K.A if you want, or with the Graveyard, where it's going to be pretty good. But in this current meta, there's not really anyone running Golem or E-Giant, which is why it's not in A or S tier like it normally would be. The Hunter's going to be going in D tier. There's not really any deck in this current meta he needs to be played in. I mean, you could use him with the Royal Giant if you want to, but even inside of Royal Giant, you're better off running another support card like the Phoenix anyway. The Royal Ghost is going to be going in A tier. You almost always see this card inside of P.E.K.K.A decks, bridge spam decks, and with the Royal Giant. The invisibility aspect of it can be very useful in a lot of situations, and it deals splash damage, which is nice, and overall has a good amount of health for the other cool features it has, so just all around a very good card. The Magic Archer is going to be going in C tier. I just think in this current meta, he's not really that great because of all the people running the Goblinstein. And as I've kind of said before for some other things, you can't really pair the Magic Archer that effectively with the Goblinstein. And on top of that, people just don't really tend to use him as much as before anyway. Even inside of decks like the P.E.K.K.A, people prefer to use other support cards nowadays over the Magic Archer. The Rascals are going to be going in D tier. You can use them if you want inside of bait decks or with the Mortar, but typically there's going to be things you would rather substitute over them just because they're fairly easy to take out. Arrows, log gets the job done against the Rascal Girls, and then the Rascal Boy is going to be fairly easy to stop as well. The Snowball is going to be going in C tier. Used to be a bit higher, but because Giant Graveyard isn't really good anymore, that's one less deck you're not really seeing ever, which the Snowball, of course, was known for being very good in. So now, for the most part, you're only seeing it with the Balloon, which means you're not seeing it as often, but of course that knockback ability can be nice to have in a lot of situations. The Royal Recruits are going to be going in D tier. The Goblinstein does pretty good against them, and if we're being honest, the regular Recruits are overall pretty weak. Pretty much everyone playing them for the most part is running the evolved version. The standard ones are just so easy to deal with because they don't charge. The Royal Hogs are going to be going in A tier. In this current meta, they are for sure one of the strongest win conditions in the game, especially in that Royal Hog EQ cycle deck, but there's also some people using the evolved Royal Recruits with the Royal Hogs as well. They definitely have made a big comeback in this current meta, and they pair very, very well with the Goblinstein too. The Monk is going to be going in C tier. The Ram Rider is very good in this meta, which the Monk pairs well with, but most Ram Rider decks prefer to have the P.E.K.K.A in it over the Monk, and Royal Giant doesn't really use the Monk much anymore either, making the Monk be kind of meh or average. The regular Goblin Giant is going to be going in C tier. I think because of how good the Evolved P.E.K.K.A is, the regular one especially isn't going to be that great, and most people using the Goblin Giant have the Evolved version. The regular Electro Drag is definitely going in D tier. Let's be honest, pretty much no one was using this card until the evolution was added to the game. So even though the evolution is in the game, it doesn't change the fact that the regular version is pretty bad. And that's why the Evolved E-Drag is probably not as OP of an evolution as people thought, because you still have to play the regular one half of the time, and not even mentioning the fact that Lightning is as good as it is in the meta, which of course is a great counter to it. And the Ram Rider, guys, is going to be the win condition that I have inside of S tier. Now, I don't know if the Ram Rider needs a nerf. It might not need one, because similarly to what we saw happen to the Prince, the Ram Rider actually got the same nerf as the Prince. The Prince was the one that ended up falling off a lot, but the Ram Rider still remains to be as OP as it is. But I don't know if it's necessarily because the Ram Rider's too OP. I think it's more so because the Evolved P.E.K.K.A is as broken as it is, which of course has fantastic synergy with the Ram Rider. The Goblin Stein also combos very, very well with the Ram Rider too, as well as the Evolved Mega Knight, or you could use some Ram Rider decks with the Monk if you would like as well. She also pairs pretty well with the Evolved E-Drag, so I think it's more so she just is fantastic in this current meta, but definitely the best win condition at the moment. The Wall Breakers are going to be going in C tier. I feel like most of the cycle decks don't really run the Wall Breakers, so you're not going to be seeing them except with the Goblin Drill or maybe minor Wall Breakers, but both of those decks aren't super prevalent in the meta anyway, so they're kind of an average card. The Earthquake is going to be going in A tier. In this current meta, it is being used so much because of how many people are using the cannon, so they want a spell, which of course is going to counter the cannon and to allow you to break through a lot easier. The Earthquake is going to pair very well with the Royal Hog Cycle deck, as well as Hog Cycle, and those are of course the main two decks you're gonna see it in, but the Hog Rider as well as the Royal Hogs are being played quite a lot, which I think makes the Earthquake have A tier being justified. The regular Goblin Cage is going to be going in D tier. The main people playing it are using the Evolution. I feel like the standard one is overall pretty weak and definitely one of the worst buildings in the game, not really getting a lot of value in a lot of situations, and I just think you're just better off using another building in almost every deck you can think of, except maybe Recruits, but there's a lot of Recruit decks that don't even use the Goblin Cage anyway. Believe it or not, guys, the Fisherman is going in S tier. I think similarly to the Ram Rider, it's because of the current meta. The Fisherman actually happens to be a good counter to the Ram Rider, which is the best win condition in the game, because of course you can pull her to the King Tower for that nice King activation. It's also going to be good against the Evolved P.E.K.K.A because you can pull her to the middle so both the towers target her and then go for guards, for example, then to DPS her down. It's also going to be very good against the Evolved Goblin Giant. It pairs very well with the Evolved Goblin Giant. It pairs well with the Evolved Mega Knight. It pairs well with the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. It's also going to be a pretty good counter to the Goblin Stein as well, because similarly to the Evolved P.E.K.K.A, you can pull the monster in the middle and have more DPS on top of it, so that way the monster doesn't end up going towards your tower, where then the ability can be used, which ends up getting a lot of damage. The Elixir Golem as well as the Healer will both be going in F tier in this current meta. Ever since the Goblin Stein has came out, there has been pretty much no one using either card. People thought maybe the Goblin Stein was going to pair well with the Elixir Golem, but that is simply not the case. The Goblin Stein does very, very well against the Elixir Golem, especially when it's in the blob forms, and the Evolved Mega Knight as well as the Evolved P.E.K.K.A do very good against it as well, making it really fall out of the meta. The regular Firecracker is going to be going in C tier. She's definitely not that good because of how many people are running arrows, and for the most part, you're only going to be able to run her in hog decks, and of course, you got to worry about that king activation. The evolved version is definitely a lot better, though. The Royal Delivery is going to be going in A tier, which is higher than I normally place it, and it's because of all the people running Royal Hog Cycle. You can also use it in Balloon Cycle decks where some people are using it as well. I think it's a decent counter to the Goblinstein because you're hitting both the monster as well as the doctor, and then once you drop it on both, the delivery, the recruit that comes out of it can actually help you kill the doctor, which can be very nice in a lot of situations, and it just all around gets a lot of value defensively for you against baity cards as well. The Skeleton Dragons will be going in B tier. I think in this meta, they're not as OP as they normally are because it's kind of shifted a bit. But of course, inside of Lava Hound decks, they're going to be a fantastic support card to have and good for baiting out spells like the Fireball, for example. The Electro Spirit is going to be going in A tier, the second best spirit in the game. I don't think it's quite as good as the Ice Spirit. It's slightly worse, but don't get me wrong, the E Spirit is very good as well. And if you aren't using the Ice Spirit in your cycle deck, then you're definitely using the Electro Spirit, where you commonly see it inside of Goblin Drill, Hog, or especially Expo, because in Expo you don't have to worry about King activations. The Electro Giant, kind of like the Golem, is very, very bad in this current meta because the Goblinstein and the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. and the Evolved Mega Knight do so good against it. So it's no wonder why it has such a struggle reaching the tower and definitely one of the worst win conditions in the game currently. The Mother Witch is going to be going in C tier. I feel like she's not as good of a support card as she used to be, and there's also less people running Graveyard, so definitely less of a reason to use her. I guess you could use her as a support card inside of a P.E.K.K.A. deck or a Royal Giant deck if you want, but she's not really a requirement even in those. The regular Goblin Drill is going to be going in C tier. I feel like it's so much weaker compared to the Evolution. I feel like the regular one is just a lot easier to deal with, and there's just a lot less people using it currently than before, especially ever since it got that nerf where it was one of the strongest win conditions in the game. I feel like now it's actually slightly below average. It's very manageable and easy to deal with, especially if you have any sort of splash card in your deck. The Phoenix is going to be going in A tier. I think it's slightly better than the Lava Hound currently, but definitely not in S tier in this current meta. But with that being said, very good inside of some beatdown decks, like with the Royal Giant, for example. You could also even use it with the P.E.K.K.A. if you want, and inside of Lava Hound, of course. Somehow, some way, guys, the Little Prince is all the way in D tier. That's right, I think the Little Prince is about the same strength as the Golden Knight now. After all the nerfs the Little Prince has gotten, and with the addition of the Goblinstein in the game, that's why it is a lot worse. In a way, you could kind of compare the Little Prince to the Goblinstein, because those are the two champions in the game that kind of have two units, if that makes sense. There's the Little Prince and the Guardian, and then with the Goblinstein, you have the Monster and the Doctor. And because the Goblinstein is as broken as it is, and it can kind of be compared to the Little Prince, it kind of makes sense why no one would want to use the Little Prince now that everyone is using the Goblinstein in its broken state. And of course, the Goblinstein is going in S tier. I mean, what a surprise. The card that the meta pretty much revolves around. The decks it's used in, the decks to try to counter it. And even though it got emergency nerfed, and it got 3 nerfs to it when they added the emergency nerfs to it, it is still not enough. As of recording this video, about half of the people inside of the top 200, which is around 50%, are using this thing. And chances are there'd be more people using it, and some people just can't run it because they don't have it maxed. The Doctor's ability is just so valuable. For only 2 Elixir, if you get the monster to reach the tower, you're getting so much damage, and you're able to kill so many things with the Doctor's ability as well, especially when there's a lot of things clumped together. You're also getting that 3-card cycle when you have it down, which you guys have to remember is another feature of the champion, which is why when a champion is very strong, it makes it appear even more broken because of that 3-card cycle. Also, it just happens to have good synergy in so many decks. I mean, the fact you can use it with the P.E.K.K.A., you could use it inside of drill decks, you can use it inside of Royal Hogs, you can use it with the Hog Rider. I've even seen some people use it inside of a Lava deck, you can use it in Loon Cycle. Pretty much you can run it in every deck in the game, except maybe Golem or E-Giant. So it's just so versatile. It's too strong. The monster's fine, but the doctor's the part of it that's too strong. In my opinion, the doctor needs to die potentially to a fireball or at the bare minimum, a poison. The Princess Tower is going to be going in S tier. Ever since the Cannoneer got a nerf in the last set of balance changes, it's pretty much, I can say with 100% certainty, the Princess Tower is for sure, without a doubt, the strongest tower troop in the game, which is why you see, for the most part, 90% of people using her at the top of ladder, as well as in competitive, instead of the Cannoneer, whereas before, it was kind of 50-50. Some people running the Princess Tower, some were running the Cannoneer. I think a lot of casual players prefer it this way because it makes the game not as confusing or pay to win, where the Princess Tower, which is the troop that has been in the game since the game has started, is the best one where people know all the interactions. But it's kind of debatable because, of course, the people that spent money on the Cannoneer or the Duchess, it kind of sucks for them. But I guess you guys can leave your thoughts on that in the comments. The Cannoneer is going to be going in B tier. That's right, guys. I think he is significantly worse than the Princess Tower, that I'm actually putting him 2 tiers lower than the Princess Tower now. Pretty much for the most part, the only deck you might see him in now might be something like Mortar. He has just fallen off quite a lot ever since they gave him that first attack nerf, so he's unable to fully counter wall breakers when they're both placed in the same lane, and he does 4% less damage as well, definitely changing a lot of interactions and making him even worse than he already was against swarmy decks, but also worse against beatdown decks because they nerf the DPS he deals as well. So it's no surprise that those 2 nerfs are going to make him a lot worse. With that being said, though, he is still surprisingly better than the Dagger Duchess, and the Dagger Duchess is going in C tier because for the most part, the only deck you're going to be seeing the Dagger Duchess in is going to be with the Elixir Golem, and the Elixir Golem happens to actually be very bad in this current meta, but I'm still going to leave the Dagger Duchess in C tier. I mean, like, you can really use her if you want to, and I'm not saying she's awful, but with something like a tower troop, something as important as that, you're always going to typically be wanting to run the best one, which is why, for the most part, there's pretty much no reason you wouldn't want to run the Princess Tower now, or maybe the Cannoneer if you really want, but the Duchess definitely going to be the worst. Alright, let's get into the evolution ranking now. So the 2 I have in D tier are the Evolved Barbarians and the Battle Ram. The Evolved Barbarians have just really gotten worse as the meta has shifted and as more evolutions have come out, and for the most part, they're only viable at all inside of Lava. But in Lava, you prefer to use the Evolved Valkyrie or the Evolved Bomber over them anyway. The Evolved Battle Ram has such a hard time reaching the tower with all these stuns in the game, all the buildings in the game. There's just a lot of resets to it, and in P.E.K.K.A decks, you're better off running the Ram Rider anyway, as well as inside of Mega Knight decks, you're better off using other support cards than the Evolved Battle Ram. The Evolved Archers are the start of C tier. There's a lot of arrows in the current meta, and there's not as many people running Giant Graveyard, which the Evolved Archers fit very well in, so for the most part, you're only seeing them inside of Expo, and I feel like the other evolutions are just a lot stronger compared to them in general. Even though the Cannoneer got nerfed, the Evolved Wall Breakers are still not really that great. They're just not too much better than the regular Wall Breakers. I feel like they're just not too much of a threat. There's also a lot of buildings in the game, and if you know what you're doing, they're fairly easy to stop, and it's kind of similar to the Evolved Bats. Their healing ability is pretty nice, but they're just so vulnerable to spells. If you get a quick zap off, arrows, rage, oftentimes their ability is practically useless. The Evolved Wizard used to be one of the best evolutions in the game, actually, but it got hit with 2 pretty big nerfs where the shield knockback isn't as much and the shield health got reduced, and it actually fell out of the meta quite a bit when those things happened. Same with the Evolved Tesla. They took away the Death Shockwave, and since then it has been a lot worse. It's not able to just defend everything like it used to be able to. The Evolved Royal Giant is I would say a pretty balanced evolution, probably slightly below average, but that ability knockback it has is quite nice. So you're unable to play something like goblins on top of it, a Skarmy, a mini P.E.K.K.A, or any ground unit that gets knocked back. So you're forced to play something else. But there are some times where, for example, if your opponent just drops an air card or an Inferno Tower where the ability is practically useless. So it's very situational. The Evolved Knight, finally, after all the nerfs he has received, is finally not one of the most broken evolutions in the game anymore. The value he gets when he's walking is quite nice, but a lot of people have actually realized the Evolved Valkyrie is the better evolution now because of that tornado she's getting, and she has a health bonus too as well, making her a very, very good tank, and people prefer having her over the Knight because on defense she can oftentimes get more value. The Evolved Ice Spirit is no longer in the lowest tiers because in cycle decks people have realized how OP it actually is. Inside of Hog and with the Royal Hogs and even the Goblin Drill, you're seeing a lot of people use the Evolved Ice Spirit now because of how much it stalls and how much value it gets you on defense, especially with how good the Evolved P.E.K.K.A is. Very useful against that. So the P.E.K.K.A gets frozen multiple times, unable to hit things and heal herself. The Evolved Goblin Cage, ever since it got that DPS buff, has helped out the card quite a bit, making it not be one of the worst evolutions in the game anymore. It pairs very well with the recruits as well as the balloon. The Evolved Zap is way worse now that it got the third strike removed. It used to be in S tier, one of the strongest evolutions in the game, and now it's a more average evolution that you're only going to see in some beatdown decks occasionally, but definitely not really that good anymore. It's getting way less value. Even though the second Zap does a lot more damage, it was way better when it had the third Zap. The Evolved Recruits are a little better. They were one of the worst, but as the meta has shifted, they have kind of come back a little bit, and I would say they're a pretty balanced evolution now. The Evolved E-Drag is actually not nearly as good as people thought it would be. It could be because there's a lot of people running Lightning in this meta, and it could also be because of the emergency nerf they gave it before it came out, but both of those things actually ended up resulting in it being a fairly balanced evolution at the moment. The Evolved Goblin Giant used to be a lot better of an evolution and might still be very good, but in this current meta, it's pretty balanced because of how good the Evolved P.E.K.K.A is, which of course is going to be pretty good against it, as well as when he spawns those goblins, that's something else for the Evolved P.E.K.K.A to kill and to get more value. The Evolved Goblin Barrel, people realize, is actually a very good evolution. People have figured out how to make it work, and when you're pressuring both lanes at the same time, that juke barrel cannot be ignored. People have realized that, and it's actually not something you can underestimate. It's a very versatile evolution, and so many people are running it in a lot of different bait decks. The Firecracker is higher than where I normally rank her. In this current meta, there's so many people using the Firecracker with the Ram Rider because she actually happens to be a pretty good counter to the Goblinstein as well as the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. So this is probably one of the few times you'll see me putting the Evolved Firecracker in A tier, even though there's a lot of people running the arrows. The Evolved Mortar ended up getting a nerf, the first attack nerf, but it didn't impact the card actually as much as I thought it would. It is still an above average evolution, and there's a lot of people using it currently. The Evolved Valkyrie, as I've already talked about, people prefer using her slightly more than the Evolved Knight. Very good tank. That tornado ability going to help you a lot, especially on defense when you're defending things like a balloon or a Hog Rider, for example, or any type of ground win condition especially. She is going to be incredible. And then also on offense as well, clumping things together in situations that call for it. The Evolved Goblin Drill got a rework. It ended up being a nerf to the card, so it's no longer an S tier, but I still think it's a very solid evolution. The fact that it spawns twice means you really, in a lot of situations, have trouble dealing with it, especially if you don't have a good cycle. It can be really, really annoying. The Evolved Mega Knight is going to be in A tier. I think the only reason why it's not in S tier is because of how OP the Evolved P.E.K.K.A is, which is such a good counter to the Evolved Mega Knight, but the ability of it is so OP. Every attack, you're knocking things back, which of course is going to make him absolutely incredible against tanks, and even things like the Hog Rider. It has no hope of getting any damage on your tower because it's constantly knocking it back. The Evolved Bomber is going to be the first card in S tier because it's basically a secondary win condition. When you're playing it at the bridge and there's something lined up for it, it is just getting so much damage. If you're not quickly taking care of it, whether it's stunning it or arrowing it, it's just going to get an infinite amount of damage on your tower. And then it's going to get even more if you pair it with something like a tornado, for example, or log or push back that unit so it continues being lined up. And it's going to be very good defensively as well. When there's things coming at you kind of like in a line or clumped together, it's going to be able to splash on top of all of those. So just getting a ton of value for only 2 Elixir, a variety of different decks you can play it in. Of course, it's going to be very good inside of cycle decks, but also inside of heavier decks as well. You can play it with the Lava Hound as well as the P.E.K.K.A. The Evolved P.E.K.K.A, in my opinion, is the second best evolution in the game currently. Even though they gave in the last set of balance changes a nerf to the P.E.K.K.A, it seemingly hasn't really done much. I think one of the biggest reasons why for that is because of the Cannoneer nerf. The Cannoneer was being played almost as much as the Princess Tower, because the Cannoneer was pretty good against tanks like the P.E.K.K.A, but because they gave a DPS nerf to the Cannoneer, that means the nerf they gave the P.E.K.K.A kind of gets canceled out, because pretty much everyone is running the Princess Tower now. So even though it's getting less heal per kill, it's still very, very valuable because the P.E.K.K.A has so much health. So is as long as it's still healing up, even though it's not as much heal, it's still very, very valuable. And it also happens to pair very well with the Goblinstein as well as the Ram Rider, which are very strong in this current meta. And the Evolved P.E.K.K.A is also a good counter to the Goblinstein as well. So it kind of makes sense why it's one of the best evolutions in the game currently. Lastly, the Evolved Skeletons, in my opinion, are the best evolution in the game currently. Pretty much every cycle deck you can think of is using them. You get to use 2 evolutions. Most cycle decks almost always have the Evolved Skeletons using one of those 2 evolution slots. Whether we're talking about the Goblin Drill, the Hog Rider, the Royal Hogs, Log Bait, whatever the Expo, whatever the cycle deck is, you're always seeing them. Heck, you even oftentimes now see them inside of heavier decks, like with the Royal Giant. There's even some people using the Evolved Skeletons with the P.E.K.K.A as well. I have seen it, as crazy as that sounds. Very, very versatile. They get so much value for only 1 Elixir. Sure, a lot of people make the argument sometimes they do nothing, and you can easily just spell them or go in for an E-Spirit, or sometimes just ignore them, and they're not doing jack squat. But there's other times, even if it's only a third of the time you use them or a fourth of the time you use them, because they're only 1 Elixir, you have many opportunities to play them. All it takes is 1 set of Evolved Skeletons oftentimes to win you the game. Even if it's not reaching the opponent's tower, it could be 1 set of Evolved Skeletons defending pretty much their whole push, or even if it doesn't defend their whole push, it's forcing a lot of Elixir out of them. Maybe they wanted to be able to go in and pressure you, but because you have Evolved Skeletons down, they're forced to defend it, or they have to overcommit to kill them if they want to continue their push. So it's just changing the flow of the game, making things very, very annoying for them, which is why there's so many pros in this game that choose to use the Evolved Skeletons, and why I think right now they are the best evolution in the game with how much they're being played. They're just so consistent, even though they might not necessarily be OP and need a nerf. Just in this meta, the amount of usage they have and consistency is why I think they are the best evolution in the game. If you guys enjoyed my evolution ranking as well as the tier list, be sure to give the video a like and subscribe if you guys are not subscribed already. You can use creator code BOSS to support me in any Supercell game. These tier lists take me a lot of time to make, so I really do appreciate all the support you guys give. I know you guys really enjoy them. They take me long to do though, but if I continue to get support, I plan to keep making them as often as I can. Thank you guys again. Until next time.